Ja, vanmôre gesels ons met Dr. Antoinette Miric van die South African Society of Psychiatrists en sy kuier saam om te gesels oor die toename in geestestoestande by gesondheidswerkers, spesifiek as gevolg van die pandemie. Good morning, Dr. Antoinette. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for
Lovely.
having me on.
Absolute pleasure.
Doctor, I think let's start with our first question. We know the last 2 years, especially on health workers and COVID-19, has been tremendously hard. And I think the obvious question then would be, are health workers struggling with mental health issues?
The quick answer is yes, but let me explain it. Let me explain it a bit further. Healthcare workers, all the research shows that in terms of prevalence of mental health conditions or mental health stresses, their prevalence of conditions has always been higher than the general population, just slightly higher. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there were lots of kind of studies coming through, and the rates of what we call distress or post-traumatic stress, not disorder, but just the traumatic stress they experienced, all over the world. We don't unfortunately have much from South Africa, but the rates were up to 80% of within certain phases, healthcare workers experiencing insomnia was a big concern, lots of sleep disruptions, and not just because of long shifts, and a lot of exposure to very stressful, very traumatic conditions, or this pre-anticipatory anxiety of what may be. So healthcare workers generally struggle a lot more. Specifically, if we even just look at doctors, there's quite a lot of research in the States looking at unfortunately, our suicide rates, our completed suicide rates, are much higher than the general population. And I think that gives you an indication of the incidence, the prevalence of mental health conditions.
I think we so often know, we're aware of the fact that all of a sudden it was longer hours, much more pressure. They were exposed to certain environments that was kind of unknown before that. But I think things we forget is the sacrifices they make also to be away from their families. I spoke to a few doctors at a stage and nurses and just general healthcare workers that said, sometimes in the hospitals, they were literally the last people to hold other people's hands whilst they were passing away because the families weren't allowed into hospitals. And all of that adds and it builds to the complete stress that they were under.
I think that's exactly true. What was quite scary for me is when I was, we formed this healthcare workers care network 2 years ago, and it was really based on research and evidence base. And while we were preparing that, I was looking at the rates, because there were some studies of the rates of burnout, specifically looking at doctors again, in say 2019, 2018. And concerningly, yes, it was very stressful, but concerningly, the rates of burnout moving into the pandemic in terms of our junior staff was already very high. Wow. We were sitting at like 60, 70%. And then you throw, healthcare workers into a crisis. And South Africans, we do work in a crisis. We do come to the party. However, the amount of emotional toll, I think we're going to be feeling for quite a few years to come. Because the intensity, specifically more maybe that second and third wave, was immense on the hospitals, immense on the staff. And that concept of being that last person, specifically our nurses, experienced a lot of the brunt of that. And it's what we call like it's a moral distress, it's a moral injury. It's something that's, some of it might have not been preventable, but some of it could have been preventable in terms of if we had vaccines earlier, if lots of different systems, had come in place. And it's that feeling of hopelessness and unable to do anything at that stage, other than be there, obviously, for the person who is passing away. But you also then, it's not, the difference with this pandemic was, I compare it to the HIV epidemic of the early kind of late 90s, early 2000s when I did my internship. It was horrific. We did not have antiretrovirals in the public sector. And I remember as a young intern walking into the ward and having to sign like 10 files a day of death certificates of people who were just admitted the day before. And it reminded me a lot of that in terms of the distress, in terms of, and it's just the events one after each other. Other stresses, which some people didn't really see, were initially there was quite a bit of a panic mode, so lots of leave was cancelled. Any leave that was scheduled was cancelled for doctors. There were lots of doctors then going off on quarantine, getting sick, which just put extra pressures on actually not even doctors or healthcare workers. I mean, sometimes they were running at like 40% of normal staffing, and the normal staffing was too little anyway. Sure. So it was incredibly stressful. And I am seeing, this year, almost every healthcare professional I've spoken to has started off the year very, very tired.
Yeah, and that's something we have to talk about later on, but we're first going to have a quick break for the news. Thank you very much, Dr. Miric. We'll chat further on now. Welkom terug. Ons gesels verder met Dr. Antoinette Miric van die Suid-Afrikaanse Vereniging vir Psychiaters. En ons praat spesifiek oor geestesgesondheid van die mediese personeel en gesondheidswerkers in hierdie stadium en hoe die pandemie dit beïnvloed. Dr. Antoinette, we referred to before the outbreak, we referred to the fact that there's a lot of stress and there's a lot of factors contributing to mental health issues with health workers. But there also seems to be a tendency to hide the fact, if you're a mental health worker, that you have a mental health issue. To hide the fact, maybe because people might think there's a stigma to it. Is that the case?
Yes, that's definitely the case. I mean, I think in the general population, there's a stigma towards mental health conditions. But in healthcare workers, there is absolutely a stigma. There is possibly a intellectual understanding, due to education programs that, healthcare workers do struggle with certain things and that help is available. However, there is such a stereotype and a pre-existing stigma that having an emotional health issue, or not even a mental health disorder, just emotional health issue, results in you being weak or being a failure or being inadequate, not being able to do your job properly, and remembering that most healthcare workers often go into the profession to heal others. That's what I hear often. As a child, I want to heal people, help people. And I think this group of people, they just tend to neglect their own needs. And they'll neglect maybe some things which are very obvious, specifically within nurses and doctors, specifically even more doctors. I see that they are very reluctant to reach out to speak to colleagues, very worried about confidentiality or lack thereof, which is not really as big an issue as I think people think, and do not want to be known to be seeking mental health or on medication, which a large majority of us are.
Yes.
But it's just a silent, secret thing which we're trying to just normalize, and because if we can't pour from empty cups, so we as healthcare workers, if we're able to support healthcare workers and improve their own mental health, we are therefore touching so many patients and so much of the public, because those people will be more resilient.
Yeah, we think about for the basic elke Jan in die straat daar buite, we think about instances where people say, wonderful doctor, he knows his stuff, but the bedside manner is terrible. Now, if you use that as a bit of a reference, and you think that doctors have this amazing responsibility and this library of knowledge to work from, but do you think medical staff are properly tooled to manage their emotions? Is there enough focus on that? And we all have emotions. 1 out of every 3 people in this country has an emotional problem that needs to be attended to. Do you think doctors and nurses in specific in this country gets enough help with that?
No, I mean, I think it starts, and I'm hoping that it's improving during the training years. I think that's where we need to start in terms of the medical schools, in terms of nurses and doctors. And there needs to be greater emphasis on emotional well-being, which I do think, looking at the younger generation, I do think it's better, that group of young 20-year-olds compared to even 30 or 40-year-olds. So I do think it's improving, but that's where it needs to start. In terms of the importance of looking after yourself. In terms of tools, a lot of people, by their nature, by the time they are healthcare workers, they're really quite resilient people. They've got into medical school, they've endured so much. So it's not really about resilience. It's more about understanding that when they do have an emotional problem, as we all do, it's so useful to reach out for help. And that doesn't have to be, it's not for a psychiatric disorder. It could just be, talking to a friend, talking to a pastor, talking to a counselor. And I'm always amazed by when I see healthcare workers, how much just a little bit of intervention makes such a difference. And that's what I want to just, get out there, that people don't have to suffer. I mean, I think a lot of healthcare workers call it burnout, which it is, but burnout actually leads to depression. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
And taking a holiday or taking a break does not cure that.
Doctor's friend of mine specifically referred to the fact that during COVID, what really got to him was the fact that he had to let so many patients go. There were so many patients that he lost, that he stood next to their bedside and realized, but they're gone now. He's not going to be able to save them. Do you think if doctors and nurses in specific have this wonderful structure that you've implemented and that you're part of, do you think if they can, let's say, an interconnectivity, let's talk about emotions, let's support each other, support structures, are there enough support systems now set in place where peers can talk to each other and talk about their emotions and their feelings?
No, I don't think they are. I mean, the South African Society for Anaesthetists have set up a great wellness program, and they've set it up for many, many years. And that was in reaction to a very high rate of death by suicide amongst that community. So they are one example. I do think that each kind of hospital or system should really look at providing a safe space to talk about these issues. It's seen as soft issues. It's seen as irrelevant at times when there's just so much else going on. But it's not. And I do encourage that, any healthcare worker we need to start this conversation amongst our colleagues. I'm lucky, and probably because I'm a psychiatrist, it's a bit biased, but I have a group of colleagues who we speak about these issues all the time, and we check in on each other. And that's very helpful. And I would encourage other groups of healthcare workers to do that, to just keep a check, because we're very bad at looking after ourselves.
Yes.
I think the problem is not just health workers. I think if we look at a society, we tend to be silent and not want to speak about any mental health issues because we are often embarrassed about it. Whereas I don't understand why, because I think there's so many people that do struggle, and once you open up about your struggles, someone else can relate to it and they will go, actually, yes, I struggle with that same thing, and in that way we help one another. But we tend to be quiet about it. It's almost like we tend to be embarrassed by mental health issues.
I think people are embarrassed by mental health issues, and it's a global phenomenon, and we're just trying to bring more and more awareness. There's just so much stigma, like in terms of even disability insurances, life insurances. I mean, there's so much stigma, medical aid funding in terms of mental health care. The stigma and the inequality between, say, having a mental health condition and having a cardiac condition is huge.
Yes.
And this is a problem, and we are going to keep talking about it. We're going to keep pushing it. But if you think about the healthcare system, they are seeing this mental health care, help being not as equal as others, and a lot of people feel that it's a failure, or you must just sort yourself out, or It's a very big concern. I think we're going to lose lots of healthcare workers to the profession in
Sure.
terms of moving away.
But let's hope that is not the case. Thank you very much, Dr. Antoinette Miric, for talking to us. Natuurlik, Dr. Antoinette Miric is van the Healthcare Workers Care Network, a wonderful initiative and something that all healthcare workers should go and look at the website, get in connection with them. It's worth it. Dankie baie, Dr. Antoinette. Nou ja,